Before we begin the video, if you've been getting value out of this channel, please consider supporting High Americana via Patreon, linked in the description. At $3,000 a month, you will help me make this a full-time job and can also request historical content to be made. Thank you. And now, a passage from Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer, an old-time sailor of the sea, by John Randolph Spears, from Chapter 6, Exploring the Antarctic Coast. Two accounts of the incidents which led to the sending of the hero on an exploring expedition along the coast of the Antarctic continent have been printed. One is to be found in Edmund Fanning's Voyages Round the World, and the other in Stonington Antarctic Explorers by Edwin Swift Balch. Fanning says that from Captain Pendleton's report, as rendered, on the return of the fleet to Stonington, it appeared that while the fleet lay at anchor in Yankee Harbor, Deception Island, during the season of 1820-21, being on the lookout from an elevated station on the mountains of the island during a very clear day, he had discovered mountains, one a volcano, in the south. This is what is now known by the name of Palmer Land. In the other account, it is said that young Palmer first saw the land, and the captain's niece, still living, remembers hearing him say definitely that he thus saw the land. Some writers have thought the two accounts contradictory, but they are not necessarily so. The facts in the case seem to be as follows. The rookery at President Harbor was being depleted rapidly. The decrease naturally led all the captains of the vessels in Yankee Harbor to talk about a search for another rookery, and this search seemed to be all the more needed, as time passed and competing vessels gathered the skins from other known rookeries. All the other known rookeries were in fact occupied by sealers. It was therefore decided that Captain Palmer should make another cruise with the hero. It was for such work that the sloop had been brought. Before going on such a cruise, it was natural that Palmer should go up to the highest point on the wall of the old crater, at a time when the air was perfectly clear, in order to see if any other islands were visible. It was also natural that Captain Pendleton should go. The direct statement that the young captain went is to be believed because he was known to be unusually far-sighted. Throughout his life, he was able to distinguish objects at much greater distances than ordinary seamen. At the same time, there is no reason to doubt the statement that Pendleton went. It is easy to believe that both Pendleton and Palmer went together, and when Pendleton made his report at Stonington, he inadvertently omitted to mention that Palmer went with him. On reaching the high point on Deception Island, the southern horizon was examined. The southern because the fleet had been working around all the islands at the north. So the loom of the land was seen in the far south, with what looked like an active volcano, and the hero was thereupon ordered to sail away and learn if any seals were to be found there. Copies of two entries in the log of Captain Pendleton's brig Frederick are among the records now to be found at Stonington. They are as follows. January 14, 1821, sloop Hero, Captain N.B. Palmer, sailed to eastward to look for more islands. January 28, 1821, 6 a.m., the sloop came in after examining northeast and southwest to their satisfaction, found none. It was therefore on January 14th that Captain Palmer sailed from Yankee Harbor on the voyage which was to place him beside Columbus, insofar as he and Columbus were the only known men who have discovered continents, for the name of the man who discovered Australia is not known. To appreciate the dangers of the voyage upon which the captain was bound, it is only needful to recall the fact that he was under orders to explore a region to the east as well as the south, which had never been visited by men, that he was to work his way among floating fields of ice and uncharted reefs, that hurricane squalls with blinding snows were sure to overtake him at frequent intervals, and that if the hero were pinched between ice floes or stranded on the rocks, there was no hope of a rescuing party ever finding the wreck. But Palmer and his men faced the dangers with insouciant minds, and even with pleasure. They were thrilled with a feeling that is now lost because there is but little of the world left to explore. Of this remarkable expedition, it appears that no account was ever written by a member of the hero's crew, or, if one was so written in the back of the logbook, as has been surmised, it was torn out and destroyed. But on his return to Yankee Harbor, Captain Palmer told the Commodore and other captains what had occurred. After he returned home, he also related his story to his family and friends. In later years, when he was in command of the clipper Haokua in Hong Kong, China, he was invited to tell the story to Admiral Sir John Francis Austen at the American consulate, for the admiral had observed that the armchair geographers of Europe were disposed to ignore Palmer's exploration, and with a sailor's love of fair play, he asked the captain for the facts in the case. The various accounts which the captain thus gave were in several instances written down by those who heard them. Consul Frederick T. Bush of Hong Kong wrote what he heard, and his version was later printed in a New London paper. Edmund Fanning wrote the story as he gathered it from Commodore Pendleton after the expedition returned home. When, beginning in 1828, an effort was made to induce Congress to send a naval exploring expedition to the far south and the Pacific, an effort which eventually resulted in the Wilkes Expedition, Mr. J. N. Reynolds, an active promoter of the movement, gathered and wrote an account which he used in his propaganda. This one was printed in the Army and Naval Chronicle, Volume 3. Another account appeared in the North American Review in 1834. Each of these versions inevitably contains some statements not found in the others, and the whole have therefore been combined here to give the story in as full detail as possible. When describing his adventure to Admiral Austen, the captain said, "I pointed the bow of the little craft to southward, and with her wings spread, the mainsail abeam, and the jib abreast, on the opposite bow, she speeded on her way like a thing of life and light. With her flowing sheet, she seemed to enter into the spirit which possessed my ambitions, and flew along until she brought me into the sight of land not laid down on my chart. The tops of 2 mountains were first seen, and then lower land, trending away in both directions, appeared as the hero drew near. The highest peak, named Mount Hope by explorer Wilkes, was in latitude 63 degrees 25 south and longitude 57 degrees 55 west. It was a rugged, verdureless land, with bare rocks and glaciers mingled everywhere within view, a most desolate region, and yet, as seen when the sun was shining, with the green waters along shore dotted with gleaming ice cakes, and with the air filled with thousands of gray and black petrels and white Cape pigeons, it was strikingly beautiful. Fanning's account of what Palmer thus observed is as follows. He found it to be an extensive mountainous country, more sterile and dismal, if possible, and more heavily loaded with ice and snow than the South Shetlands. There were sea leopards on its shore, but no fur seals. The main part of the coast was icebound, although it was in the midsummer of this hemisphere, and a landing consequently difficult. So far as the weather was concerned, the young captain had much better fortune than he had any reason to expect. But the fogs were frequently so thick that he was obliged to lay to at midday and wait until they thinned away lest he strike the ice or a reef. And it was because of the prevailing fog that he had one of the most startling experiences recorded in the histories of the explorers. The hero, in her return, had left Mount Hope on the north point of the mainland astern, late one afternoon, when a fog so dense that the man at the tiller could not see the man on lookout at the bow shut her in. She was then hove to in the usual course, the sails were arranged so that she would make as little headway as possible, and then all hands settled down with such patience as they could summon to await the coming of the next day. Although the breeze was light and the sloop drifted but slowly before it, the captain and his mate, Mr. Phineas Wilcox, kept a vigilant watch all night for a change in the weather as well as for rocks and ice. The men, there were 6 before the mast, were placed on lookout at the bow and waist, while the officers paced the quarterdeck. At 12 o'clock that night, Captain Nat came on deck to relieve Mate Wilcox. The captain paced the deck, as all ship officers do when on watch at night, until 12:30, when he struck the sloop's bell a single tap. It was a part of the regular routine which had been followed ever since Stonington had been left astern. But when the sound of the bell rang through the fog, an answering stroke was heard off one bow, with a second one off the opposite quarter. The response startled me, said the captain, when relating the story in Hong Kong. But I soon resumed my pace, turned my thoughts homeward, and applied myself to building castles in the air until 1 o'clock. Then he struck 2 bells that were answered as before. I could not credit my ears, declared the captain. I thought I was dreaming, because, save for the screeching of the penguins, the albatrosses, the pigeons, and the mother-carried chickens, I was sure no living object was within leagues of the sloop. The sailors, being more superstitious, believed the sounds were of supernatural origin, and even mate Wilcox expressed the same idea when he declared the sounds were tricky. To the sailors, the sounds were not a little fearsome, and to all very mystifying. At 3:30 o'clock the mate came on deck and asserted that he heard human voices. A little later the fog suddenly cleared away when the mystery was solved, for a fine frigate was seen off the sloop's starboard bow, a sloop of war off the port quarter, and a ship's cutter, full manned and under the command of an officer in uniform, was soon seen coming to the Hero. Meantime, Captain Palmer made haste to hoist the stars and stripes, and the two warships then displayed the Russian flag. When the cutter arrived beside the sloop, the officer in command stepped on deck and explained how it happened he had come. The two warships, he said, had been sent out by the Tsar of Russia to explore the seas of the far south, and while sailing to the westward, they had been compelled by the fog to lie to. The bell of the sloop had been heard on the warships, and when the fog had lifted, the cutter had been ordered to learn what vessel it was from which the sound had come. The commanding officer, Captain F.G. von Bellingshausen, he continued, presented his compliments and begged the pleasure of meeting the captain of the sloop in the cabin of His Imperial Majesty's frigate Rostock. I assented, said Captain Palmer in his Hong Kong narrative of the incident. I at once entered the boat, was laid alongside, mounted to the deck, and I was ushered into the presence of the venerable commander. The scene as that young Yankee captain entered the cabin of the frigate might well be reproduced by an artist of talent, for the captain of the frigate was seated at a table with a group of his officers, all in brilliant uniform, around him, while the young sealer, smooth-faced, tall and slender, was dressed in a sealskin coat and boots of his own make, and he had a sou'wester on his head. To the naval officers the boy certainly was a bizarre figure, but when they looked into his far-seeing eyes they perceived that he was unabashed and fully able to meet them as man to man. The captain of the frigate, he was made an admiral on his return home, and is so called in the various narratives of this incident, arose to greet Captain Palmer, shook his hand, ordered a chair placed for him, and then said, "You are welcome, young man. Be seated." The conversation which followed was as follows, so far as remembered. "What is your name?" "Nathaniel Palmer." "Where are you from?" "Stonington, Connecticut, USA." "The name of your boat?" "Hero." "What are you doing here?" "On a sealing expedition. A fleet from Stonington is at work among the islands here." "What islands are those in sight?" "The South Shetlands. And if you wish to visit any of them in particular, it will afford me pleasure to be your pilot, for I am well acquainted with them." He also mentioned the harbor where the sealing vessels were at anchor, and added that water with an abundant supply of wild fowl might be obtained anywhere among the islands. "I thank you," continued the captain, "but previous to our being enveloped in the fog, we had a glimpse of those islands, and concluded we had made a discovery. But behold, when the fog lifts, to my great surprise, here is an American vessel, apparently in as fine order as if it were but yesterday she had left the United States. Not only this, but her master is ready to pilot my ships into port, where several of his own nation lie at anchor. We must surrender the palm of enterprise to you Americans, and content ourselves with following in your train." "You flatter me," replied the captain, "but there is an immense extent of land still further south, and when the fog there is entirely dissipated, you may have a full view of it from your masthead." "How far south have you been?" asked the captain. Captain Palmer told him the latitude and longitude of the point at which Hero turned back, and described the coast along which she had sailed. "Indeed," exclaimed the Russian, "then I am entirely anticipated in my object." He now arose much agitated, and begged Captain Palmer to produce the Hero's logbook and chart. Palmer at once sent to the sloop for them. While waiting for the messenger to return, breakfast was served, with Palmer seated at the side of the Russian captain. While they were at the table, many questions were asked about the seal fishery, the ports of the South Shetlands, the hailing port of the sealing fleet, and about the character of the vessels themselves. The Hero's log and chart arrived while the two were yet at the table, and were placed before the Russian captain. For a time he examined them without saying anything. Then he arose from the table and exclaimed, What do I see, and what do I hear from a boy in his teens? That he is commander of a tiny boat of the size of the launch of my frigate, in which he has pushed his way to the pole through storm and ice, has sought and found the point. I, in command of one of the best appointed fleets at the disposal of my august master, have for 3 long weary years searched day and night for. Then placing his hand on Palmer's head, he continued, What shall I say to my master? What will he think of me? But be that as it may, my grief is your joy. Wear your laurels with my sincere prayers for your welfare. I name the land you have discovered in honor of yourself, noble boy, Palmerland.